It is our honor and privilege to have Honorable Justice A.P. Shah as our chief guest today. Justice Ajit Prakash Shah hails from a family of lawyers, which lent him a deep understanding of legal matters from an early age. Upon completing his graduation from Solapur, Justice Shah obtained his law degree from Government Law College, Mumbai. After practicing at the District Court in Solapur for a short period, Justice Shah shifted to the Bombay High Court in 1977 and joined the chambers of the then leading advocate Shri S.C. Pratap, gaining experience in civil, constitutional, service, and labor matters. He was appointed as an additional judge of the Bombay High Court on 18th December 1992 and became the permanent judge of the Bombay High Court on 8th April 1994. He assumed charge as the Chief Justice of Madras High Court on 12th November 2005 and was transferred as the Chief Justice of the Delhi High Court on 7th May 2008. After his retirement from Delhi High Court, he served as the chairman of the Law Commission of India. The 20th Law Commission of India, led by Justice A.P. Shah, came out with the 246th report in 2014 on amendments to the Arbitration and Conciliation Act of 1996. The report suggested large-scale amendments to the Act to overhaul the arbitration system in India. Justice Shah continues adjudicating various domestic and international arbitration matters and is also known for writing several landmark judgments during his earlier terms as a judge in the Bombay High Court and as the Chief Justice of the Madras High Court. Defending the freedom of speech and expression, he once quashed the orders of the government not to telecast the national award-winning documentaries based on the terrorism in Punjab and the Ayodhya issue. As the Chief Justice of the Delhi High Court, Justice Shah is well known for heading the benches that delivered the recent decisions in the Nas Foundation and the Judges' Assets case. In the Nas Foundation case, the central government, which opposed the argument for decriminalizing Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, accepted the High Court's reasoning decriminalizing adult consensual sex and decided not to appeal against it. Today, Honorable Justice A.P. Shah will enlighten us on the topic, transforming in policing, a mere dream or a real possibility. With the theme of Pcgt National Youth Parliament 2021 being era of reforms, we are indeed privileged to have Justice A.P. Shah as the chief guest for this edition. I now request Honorable Justice A.P. Shah to share his words of wisdom. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind words. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be invited here by the Public Concern for Governance Trust and the Praveen Gandhi College of Law. I'm delighted to be speaking to such bright young minds today, the future of the country, and also to be here in the presence of Mr. Julio Ribeiro, who is someone I have admired almost all my life. Mr. Ribeiro spoke about his days in Solapur. I also use this occasion to relate a small episode from my childhood. I grew up in Solapur, my hometown, which in those days was a small town in Maharashtra. When I was in school, Mr. Ribeiro was the district superintendent of police. I must have been in the 4th or 5th standard at that time. The local officers club had organized a fancy dress competition. The movie Boot Polish, produced by Raj Kapoor, had released recently. It was a story about 2 orphan children who learned to shine shoes instead of begging. Many of you might be familiar with the popular song, Nanne Munne Bachche Tere Muthi Mein Kya Hai, from the movie. My uncle decided that I should participate in the contest, dressed up as one of the orphan children from the movie. And I happened to win first prize. Mr. Ribeiro was at the award ceremony and gave the prize. I wonder if Mr. Ribeiro remembers my role playing the boot polish. But this was not my only encounter with Mr. Ribeiro as a child. As he mentioned, my father was the government bidder. As a result of his position, Mr. Ribeiro had occasion to come to our house. Indeed, a few distinguished police officers like Mr. Ribeiro came to our home those days. Those officers were known for their honesty, sincerity, and integrity, and have been an inspiration for my generation and beyond. Besides having been an upright police officer with a distinguished and inspirational career, Mr. Ribeiro is also the nation's conscience keeper, a role that is becoming more and more difficult but critical in this day and age. The era when I was growing up was in the early days of independent India. The enthusiasm and energy in the country to do something, anything that was good and positive and meaningful was something that you could sense in the air. All our institutions, even if they were colonial legacies, were staffed with many people who were genuinely invested in nation building. The police force also had some such people. By and large, the police, despite being somewhat flawed, were respected. To be fair, crime itself was very different from what it is today. So the police were not dealing with the kinds of troubles what you see today. For example, heinous crimes were fewer and the underworld was almost non-existent. In those days, the Bombay police especially was legendary. Many even compared it with Scotland Yard, the foremost British force responsible for policing London. At least well into my student days, I would always read and see many reports on how excellent the Bombay police force was. And overall, there was a feeling of awe every time they were mentioned. But as time went by, when I started my practice as a lawyer and later became a judge, I could see things deteriorating with my own eyes. The trust deficit between the police and the people, which institutions like the Bombay police and officers like Ribeiro had so carefully built up, began to crumble. Until now, we have reached a stage where it is almost at the point of no return. This brings me to my topic of discussion today. Here, have we reached a stage where the idea of a police that can work to protect the people is beyond hope? We cannot possibly imagine a modern state progressing without a humane and efficient police force supporting it. Today, I want to talk about where we are with regard to the state of affairs of the police and contemplate on what we need to do in order to reverse the trends we are seeing now and reach a stage where a transformed police system helps transform the nation. The subject of policing and the role of the police as a central pillar in nation building was never out of sight or out of mind. But arguably, interest in the issue has renewed because of the latest series of scandals that have emerged over the recent few months. At this juncture, I think it is worth doing a sort of stock taking of where we stand today with regard to the police. One big story has captured our attention recently and is still rapidly developing by the day. Two key players are involved. One is Sachin Hindurao Waze, a once suspended but now reinstated Assistant Police Inspector of Maharashtra Police. And the other is Parambir Singh, former Police Commissioner of India, of Mumbai, who upon his transfer recently chose to make some startling allegations about the working of the police system. Waze, known as an encounter specialist, was once regarded as a key member of the Mumbai Encounter Squad and was involved with the deaths of over 60 alleged criminals. In truth, he had nothing to his credit other than being an encounter specialist. He was suspended for 17 years after his arrest in a custodial death case, but was granted bail. Surprisingly, despite pendency of the case, he was reinstated in June 2020, as reports suggest, by Mr. Parambir Singh under the pretext of the COVID-19 pandemic having led to a shortage of hands in the service. Meanwhile, there was a security lapse in the city where explosives were discovered outside Mukesh Ambani's home. Parambir Singh was instantly removed from his post as Mumbai Police Commissioner on 18th March 2021 in these unceremonious circumstances. Immediately upon the transfer, Singh wrote a public letter to Chief Minister Uddhav Thackeray, making a complex wave of allegations, notably that State Home Minister Anil Deshmukh was guilty of extortion and claiming that Deshmukh had directed Waze to collect ₹100 crore every month from bars and restaurants. Ironically, Waze was supposedly carrying out the investigation in Ambani's case, was himself alleged to be involved in the bomb scare and the death of a car dealer, Mansukh Hiren, and was sent to the custody of National Investigation Agency. Waze has since made several new allegations of extortion against various politicians. If this is all true, it points to a systemic extortion racket run by the politicians with the help of the police. The High Court has directed the CBI to make preliminary investigations. Mr. Deshmukh has also resigned from the post since. Now the Supreme Court has affirmed the order of the High Court. Arguably, Mr. Singh's conduct should also be questioned, however much he may choose to paint himself in a positive light, for why he would make public such a sensational story the moment he is transferred. The jaded Indian public is sadly also not entirely unfamiliar with this concept of hafta vasuli, although the values involved are certainly of an unprecedented order. Even as the Bombay story has taken up all the airtime of our TV screens, we must place it in context of a series of other highly publicized incidents involving the police that have emerged over recent years. In Hyderabad, 4 men accused of rape and murder who were already under arrest were shot dead and killed in an alleged encounter, seemingly in response to baying cries of the public to have them appropriately punished. Elsewhere, in the Hindi heartlands, the notorious gangster Vikas Dubey was also killed in an encounter by the Uttar Pradesh police while in custody. His house containing valuable evidence conveniently burned down, turning into smoke all the information that might have been revealed regarding his association with and assignments for the powerful and mighty amongst the political and bureaucratic classes. Indeed, encounters which were once considered unique to the Bombay police seem to have now become the preferred mode of policing in UP, with the current Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath himself pronouncing that if anyone poses a problem or makes life difficult, unko thok denge. Reports suggest that over 800 people have been killed in such encounters in UP recently. The early days of the pandemic lockdown led to the death of Jairaj and Benix, father and son, shop owners in Santhankulam town near Tuticorin in Tamil Nadu, due to custodial torture by the Tamil Nadu police. They had been taken into custody for allegedly violating lockdown rules of requiring shop owners to shut shops early. Custodial deaths, and this incident in particular, are unquestionably the utmost brutal face of the police. In Delhi too, where I'm speaking from, the police are not without concern. The recent Delhi riots that happened in the wake of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the investigations that followed reveal how clearly biased the police are. The actions of the police have virtually criminalized the protesters while turning a blind eye to the hate-mongers among politicians from the BJP-led government. The police have been employing with impunity provisions relating to sedition and under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act to bring protesters to book, not appreciating that these criminal provisions are extremely problematic in themselves, which ought to require far more stringent test before being applied. This is only what has happened recently and what the media has decided is worthy of sensationalizing. Surely there are hundreds of thousands of stories that have been buried in the annals of recent history, which we will never get to hear. But these stories in themselves are also enough to give us a glimpse into many of the ills that plague the police in India today. It is evident from several recent actions of the police that they can become completely biased depending on who their political overlords are. In today's political climate, this has meant a communalization of the police force and a clear hostility against minority communities. They appear to be no longer accountable to anyone except the political class. All law and order agencies in the country, from sublocal to national, have been compromised. Indeed, they are being used as mere fronts for pushing the political agenda and using the tools they have in their control, such as arrest and the threat of prosecution, for crushing any kind of dissent against the prevailing political ideology. Even during elections, which is a great democratic exercise, not only the police, but other investigating agencies like the NIA and even the income tax authorities are being used against political opponents. All sense of balance seems to have been lost. It appears to me in the last year or so, especially when already faced with global health emergency, we have seen a very dark side of the police. In this scenario, in this bleak picture that I painted just now, many obvious questions emerge. Was this the police conceived by our founders? I would imagine it was quite the opposite. Is the police, through these actions I have described, operating within the bounds of democratic and constitutional principles? Surely not. Is there a way to free the police from the shackles of political control? Is it possible for an ordinary citizen to dream of a sensitive and caring police force that looks out genuinely for their well-being and protection? Is there a hope for reform? If yes, how can it be done? What does the future hold for policing in India? Before we attempt to answer these questions, if they are indeed answerable, we must recognize that the police is just one cog in the wheel of the law and order machinery in the country. In order to understand the problems of the police, we must also understand the state of the entire criminal justice system. It takes no genius to acknowledge that our criminal justice system is in fact practically collapsed. Our prosecutorial system is rife with overwork and limited competence. Our courts are failing to keep up with adjudicatory duties, even they keep piling up every day. Our procedural laws are ancient, with colonial era ideas trying to govern a technologically advanced nation. In this scenario, we cannot possibly expect the police to transform itself. Other issues also need to be addressed. The judiciary needs to be beefed up, and we need to abandon useless and dated laws and devise new legislative tools to tackle new problems. It has to be a holistic approach, and it is not sufficient to point fingers merely at the police. I have spoken about many of these issues before, and while acknowledging that this is a problem that cannot be tackled in isolation, for today's conversation, I restrict myself to understanding a little deeper as to the issues with police alone. I already mentioned that we are living with laws designed for another era, and the police are very much a central feature of that ancient system. The Police Act came into being in 1861 and was a legislative response of the British Empire to the revolt of 1857. The duties entrusted upon the police were essentially to suppress and repress freedom fighters. This continued well into the 20th century, and especially in the 1920s and 1930s, when the freedom movement had reached its peak. The police, therefore, was always an instrument of colonial powers. This construct of the police as a tool of the governing class has remained with us even 70 years after independence, even though arguably there might be idealistic intentions of making the police a force that is truly responsible for protecting the people of the country. The many stories that have emerged in the recent years, and especially in the last 12 to 18 months, reveal that the police has certain endemic problems. It is ridden by corruption. Some of its investigative techniques and tactics are highly questionable. It is mostly under the thumb of political masters. The Hafta Vasuli racket, for example, that Paramveer Singh has referred to in his letter, cracks open the maze of corruption that the police are involved in. Everyone has anecdotal knowledge of the Hafta racket, and senior IPS officers have already spoken about it in public in the past. Sanjay Pandey gave a long interview on the show Satyameva Jayate in 2014. Miran Borwankar spoke about it recently in a newspaper interview. Basically, small business owners like restaurants or shopkeepers or bar owners are constantly under the vigilance of various departments and laws. The police abuse the authority they have to challan them. And in order to avoid harassment, the business owners pay up. These have become deeply entrenched in the ordinary way of life and are considered a common means of making money. Police officer Miran Borwankar calls it a well-oiled money-making mechanism. If everyone pays up as per the agreement, there are no complaints. But if someone on either side is unhappy for some reason, it becomes a problem. The fact is, especially in these Hafta Vasuli cases, the police and politicians are in cahoots with each other. Transfers and postings of police officers are also very closely connected with this business. Some postings are considered lucrative. Those officers who do not cooperate get transferred to less lucrative posts. Despite SC judgment on transfers, this practice has gone unabated, with the exception of Kerala, where there have been attempts to make postings on merit. Another concern is that of this practice of encounter killing. Ordinarily, in law, an encounter killing may be considered legitimate only if it is in the exercise of self-defense. The test for self-defense has developed in Indian criminal law over decades and is a stringent test to meet. Only if a police officer feels that his or her life is in danger can an encounter killing be considered as justified. But this provision has been abused rampantly, as in cases in Bombay, Hyderabad, and Uttar Pradesh show us. Here I must relate something that I recall from my days as a judge in the Bombay High Court. One young 19-year-old boy by the name Abu Saima, a hawker, had been killed in 1997 in an alleged encounter. The case came up before me. The police insisted that he was a dreaded criminal and gangster named Javed Fauda. The argument was that the police were doing their job and risking their lives to keep the public safe from the dreaded criminal. The boy's mother said he was a poor hawker on the streets. The police said that they learned he was coming to the area. They said that he opened fire when he saw the cops. The cops fired back. All bullet injuries were found in his head, heart, or brain. No FIR was filed. The matter was closed. You must know that such cases follow a template or a pattern of sorts. And this case falls exactly within that template. An alleged criminal is on the run. The police coincidentally happen to accost the criminal on the streets. The criminal opens fire against or otherwise attacks the police. The police fire back in self-defense and the criminal is conveniently killed. In such incidents, rarely are any police personnel injured themselves. And often, there is also not enough foolproof evidence to show that the alleged criminal in question actually happened to fire or targeted the police. You will notice this template was followed in all headline cases that I mentioned earlier. Waze's various so-called victories, the Hyderabad encounter, the UP shootout. To return to the case I was hearing as a court, almost 100 cases were brought in connection with the case and several petitions as including by the PUCL. I was satisfied with the facts presented before me and ordered an inquiry. There were some 110 such encounters, but I used Abu Saima case and 2 others as sample cases. The responsibility for putting this report together was entrusted to a principal judge who conducted an elaborate inquiry and presented a detailed report which clarified our early suspicions about the cases. The report said that all the 3 encounters, so-called encounters we had asked to look him into were fake. This report was challenged by the police. Unfortunately, the report was rejected by the division bench before which it was presented in 1999. The division bench said that there was nothing suspicious about the encounters and that everything was above board. It is strange and unusual that a fact-finding committee appointed by the High Court was rejected by the very same High Court itself. The matter went to the Supreme Court and led to a judgment in 2014. The matter was taken up after 15 years, where 16 principles have been laid down by the Supreme Court in cases of encounter in this matter of PUCL versus State of Maharashtra. But this decision has really done nothing to change things in the country. Nothing has changed in the police system. Encounter killings still routinely continue. And more troublingly is that they are now increasingly celebrated as though some kind of war has been won. Encounter specialists are deified almost and are subjected to hero worship. Recall that Sachin Waze, the encounter specialist who has been in the news later, even had a movie made on him in Marathi called Reggae. This kind of deification effectively ends up encouraging other police officers to do the same. But in fact, proper policing ought to focus on protecting the people, following due process of law, such as information collection and detection. Violence is not the only and certainly not the first way to achieving results. It is important that these so-called encounter specialists are not given any special importance or exalted status either by the public or by fellow officers. They should receive no special favors. In fact, some of the police commissioners in the past did intervene and disbanded this practice, including Miran Borwankar, who spoke to the newspaper on this issue very recently. But still, encounters have not been ended completely. A related problem is that of custodial deaths. Sometimes alleged criminals who are already in custody end up dying before their case is finally adjudicated upon. In the Hyderabad case, the 4 accused of gang raping, murdering, and charring the body of a young woman veterinarian were killed in custody in an encounter. So this was a case of an encounter killing which led to a custodial death. Before I go into the problems with custodial deaths, I must pause and reflect on the aftermath of the killing itself. There was what some commentators called a wave of delirium that spread through some pockets of the country after the four men were killed. When the original crime was first reported, there was massive anger and outrage nationwide. Even parliamentarians begged for a public lynching of conveniently. Such things are always convenient, aren't they? A week later, the 4 accused were killed. Even as many people celebrated this killing, it was in fact a very sad moment for all of us, for it was representative of the complete and utter collapse of the rule of law in our country. It is possible that the police actually undertook the killing to distract its detractors away from its usual process. The fortunate to have swung for the country very often The police reluctant even register cases of rape or sexual harassment in the first place. Unnao being a classic example. Incident tells adventurism. This also effectively vigilantism and tells the public that it is okay to take the law into your own hands. Also remember that no one really knows what exactly happened to Shirpurkar. But there has been no report since the last 15 months. The main point that almost everyone who has supported the killing has missed is this. How do we know that the 4 men who were caught and killed were actually those who committed the crime? We know that many unsuspecting and innocent persons are routinely picked up by the police and remain in as under trial for years only to be eventually found not guilty and released. In this particular case, we are therefore saying in the same breath that the police cannot be trusted because they often unfairly accuse innocent of crime they have not committed. But here, we are sure that police identified the criminals correctly and punished them appropriately. How terrifyingly dangerous and morally problematic an assumption is that? Let us assume the opposite as well. Let us assume that these were in fact guilty of crime. Is retribution by way of a violent extrajudicial killing the only way to resolve such cases? What does this reveal of the morals of our society? The fundamental concern in this incident is not that certain criminals were killed or that due revenge and retribution was taken for the crime they were believed to have committed without having proven it in the court of law. The fundamental concern is that there is a collective collapse of the people's faith in the criminal justice system and due process of law. The prosecutors, the police, the courts are all equally part of that system. What prompted such jubilation among the public for the alleged perpetrators getting killed without trial? That is the question we should be asking, really, not whether the killing was justified or whether it should be classified as a custodial death or anything else on those lines. Public reaction to custodial deaths also swings wildly depending on the identities of the people killed. The deaths of the shop owners, Jairaj and Benix, were also custodial deaths, but they prompted a very different response from the general public, which was outraged at the impunity of the police to do such a thing. This morally grey collective conscience that is unable to distinguish between objectively clear due process or the rule of law and emotionally charged retributive action is what should we be concerned about. Another important thing to note is that the conviction rate in custodial death and encounter cases is tending towards zero. Hardly any police officer has been successfully convicted in such cases. Either the trial is delayed or something also fortuitously or again conveniently happens to prevent conviction. Between 2000 and 2018, the National Human Rights Commission received over 5,300 plus complaints of custodial deaths. Only 26 police personnel were convicted for custodial death. The NHRC did nothing in this regard. Indeed, the less said about the NHRC, the better. The NHRC was vibrant when led by Justice Venkat Chalaya and Justice Verma. But under the last 2 police chiefs, it has become practically dormant. For the past decade or so, the NHRC has done little or nothing to serve the purpose of human rights in our country and has shown no leadership in the field. The Jairaj and Benix incident also brings to the fore the concerns of other practices of the police, particularly torture. The 2 men were mercilessly thrashed and eventually beaten to death by the police for the so-called offense of keeping a shop open during lockdown, which would have otherwise invited only up to 3 months in jail. Sadly, the police were not the only guilty party in their deaths. Before they died, the police sought to extend their custody, which a judge granted mechanically, without seeing the accused or questioning the rationale for the extension. All this, of course, reinforces the fact that we are living with a completely broken system of law enforcement. The Tamil Nadu police is notorious for its torturous methods and was rightly called out for this incident as well, and publicly and roundly criticized for the same. But this is not restricted to Tamil Nadu alone. Torture is integral to police culture all over India. Indeed, in some investigations, such as terror cases, the torture is treated as a centerpiece. Many current laws, in fact, facilitate the use of torture, such as the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act and the older Prevention of Terrorism Act, which continues refurbished as the Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act. How do we undo all this? For torture specifically, there is a clear solution. Create a stringent legal framework aligned with principles of international law under the UN Convention of Torture. Hundreds of countries have adopted this convention. Although India also signed the convention in 1997, it is yet to ratify it. It can be ratified only by passing a law. A weak torture law was allowed to lapse by the UPA government. And the Supreme Court has rejected multiple petitions requesting the government to urge that to make a torture law. In doing so, the court has turned its back on its own glorious jurisprudence and its effort to aid lawmaking in the past. The story of the torture reveals a betrayal of the people of India by successive governments. There have been opportunities for over 2 decades to enact a law, but these have been avoided. Clearly, all governments enjoy the status quo, where the police are used as a tool for self-preservation. So, ladies and gentlemen, even as I speak here and criticize the police for all the troubles that have become endemic to the system, there are many things that must be acknowledged as well, which may have accelerated the situation that the police find themselves in today. Decades of being abused as a force to serve the rurals rather than the people have also led to neglect. As a result, the police almost all across the country work in abominable conditions. Some police stations, even today, do not have either wireless devices or telephones, or occasionally even neither. Some reports say that only 2/3 police stations have access to fully functional computers, and that nearly 25% of stations in a survey of 22 states do not have vehicles. This is besides the fact that daily work day is 14 hours long and no weekly offs. Training and keeping the police up to date with new developments is also extremely poor. Except for a few handful police training institutes like that in Hyderabad and in a couple of other locations, there are really not any training institutions worth their salt in India today. There is also no uniform system of recruitment in the states particularly. Some states recruitment is through the State Public Service Commission, through some other methods, and there was a suggestion that it should be made a federal subject, which I completely oppose. But we should have some sort of a uniform system of recruitment. Let us not even begin to speak of diversity in the police force. Where are the women? Women are only 9% in police force. Where are the minorities? One number put it as near 3% in police in India. Also, by talking of recruitment, we should also be focusing on how to increase the number of skilled officers and reduce the constabulary force to optimize on the quantity or the quality of police nationalities. And it's a very important suggestions which has been made repeatedly by different commissions, and it has not been implemented. The police to population ratio is another issue, which in fact exacerbates the workload problem. Reports suggest that nationally, on average, one police person is responsible for the safety of 858 persons. This is somewhere near to the ideal laid down internationally. But the national average disguises the realities in many parts of the country. Bihar has one police person for 1,548 persons. West Bengal has one for every 12484 persons, and Assam one for every 1243. In contrast, Punjab has won for nearly 462 persons. Policing in India is also routinely abused by VIP culture. I have no numbers, but surely to the ordinary observer, it seems that a significant percentage of the police force is reputed to protect politicians and their families. Why do our politicians need so much police protection? When traveling from Coimbatore to Uti, when I was Chief Justice in the Madras High Court, I saw police at every 100 meter or 100 feet or so. Apparently because the governor was traveling that route by car, there must have been around 500 to 700 policemen. There was no reasonable justification for this. All I could think of at that time was that it was such a waste of precious resources. It was almost like personal bodyguards, leaving a very few personnel available for investigation, solving heinous crimes, and for the protection of the people. And we do not even think about the actual conditions in which the police personnel actually work and live. We need to acknowledge that our police are working under extremely adverse conditions where they are stressed, strained, and very frustrated, combined with low pay and poor working conditions. They are expected to be on duty at all odd hours. No one talks about their mental health at all. Surely we can creative about their work environment and management of the police to tackle these concerns and transform it into a humane, professional, and service-oriented force. Some schemes are easily devised. Police public schools, banking cooperative institutions, IT kiosk, housing societies, horticulture and production units like police garments, bakery, etc. are some suggestions that have been made in the past that can help to enrich the quality of living of the police. A police hospital in all states capital, similar to military hospitals, to treat serving and retired police personnel. Police departmental store to supply provisions and household items at subsidized rates would also help immensely. Some states like Madhya Pradesh have already implemented some of these schemes. Until changes actually happen, our police system will remain in shambles. And what is sadder still is that these problems are an open secret, really. Despite this, police system has never had any systemic reforms. The so-called reforms have been taken place either at the state level or amidst political control. Indeed, a spate of reports were initiated by the government. The judiciary has also participated in the process. Several judgments over the years have made recommendations regarding the police system. Notable amongst them, as law students, you must be aware, Jogendra Kumar versus State of UP in 1994, D.K. Basu versus State of Bengal in 1997. This is to prevent police atrocities and observe the rule of law. And the most recent one being Prakash Singh versus Union of India in 2006, where the court laid down the police reforms. In the Prakash Singh's case, the Supreme Court directed all the states to set up police establishment boards. It recommended a fixed tenure for DGPs and recommended that state security commissions and police complaints authorities be set up at state and district levels. Besides this, it also recommended an inquiry into allegations of serious misconduct and abuse of power by police personnel. Some states have brought in laws in line with Prakash Singh's judgment, but believe me, they are really in letter and spirit, they are not consistent with Prakash Singh's judgment. And most of the guidelines given by the Supreme Court have been diluted. There is another concern. The Supreme Court has only issued guidelines on this issue and has taken no action itself to check if these guidelines are being implemented. Prakash Singh, for example, is now forgotten, erased from memory. The Supreme Court has not demanded any accountability from states in this regard. You might argue that there have been talks of reform, and that is as enough. No one is talking about it and how the police must change. And all these reforms conversations, beside having taken place in a certain kind of politically charged environment, have tended to focus on narrow micro questions most restricted to police administration, there have been no talk of a long-term radical transformation, reconfiguring the idea of policing itself and redesigning the purpose that the force is supposed to serve. Arguably, that is the kind of conversation we need today. We do not need reforms that do not pay attention to people's concern or that are mere exercise in bureaucratic whimsy. When one speaks of reforms or transformation, everyone needs to be a part of the discussion. The real problems are systemic. The bulk of cases in the criminal system are petty offenses. Highly trained police officers who are already a limited and scarce resource should not be concerned with matters like these. I would argue that their training and skills are better put to use if they focus on investigating serious crimes. They should not be part of all these petty criminal cases, which should not be a part of the regular judicial system. And also, they should not be, these skilled officers should not be part of any security concerns of the most of the politicians, except the few ones which are very precious. I would also argue that their training and skills are better put to use if they focus on some investigating some important cases. Another major concern in the police is that of leadership. The Supreme Court had suggested that top posts should be appointed by committee comprising the Prime Minister, the leader of the opposition, and the Chief Justice of India, and equivalent authorities at the state level, meaning thereby Chief Minister, leader of the opposition in the state, and the Chief Justice of the High Court. But this has never been implemented. Right now, leadership roles are mostly political appointments. A mechanism like this will reduce the vice-like grip that politicians have over the force right now. Do not be mistaken. I just want to make one thing clear. And do not presume that I'm recommending a police force that is unaccountable. No accountability is very dangerous. Indeed, the police force must be accountable. And the political executive is the most obvious institution to exercise this supervisory control. However, there are ways and means to ensure that this relationship between the police and the executive are not abused so as to lose focus over the essential purpose of policing in the first place. I'm also disappointed in the Supreme Court and High Courts in handling the systemic issues that are coming up before them. The Prakash Singh judgment came after notices to all state governments, and hearings went on for several years. The final directions that form a part of that judgment are based on a large body of previous reports as well as best practices. The Supreme Court has not done enough to implement these directions. Indeed, after the judgment, the Supreme Court has practically not even touched the issue and certainly not bothered to see if its judgment was being implemented in letter and spirit, which it has not. Ideally, the Supreme Court should have enforced its own directions. As an example, take the present case, the Parambir Singh case. The Supreme Court first acknowledged that it's a serious matter and told the council that the Prakash Singh is chanted like a mantra by everyone. It's Supreme Court's own judgment. But instead of taking up the case itself, it directed the matter to the Bombay High Court. The High Court in turn has directed the Central Bureau of Investigation to conduct a preliminary investigation and submit a report in 15 days. Unfortunately, however, the court is also treating this as a one-time litigation and not as a systemic problem. The police-politician nexus is a very much larger issue. It is not just about one letter that has been made public, exposing the goings-on in the police force. It is a problem that has permeated into every police force all over the country. The NN Vora committee has already clearly demonstrated that there exists a nexus between police, criminals, and politicians. One more thing I would like to mention, that perhaps the court should have avoided the involvement of the CBI. I mean, the Chief Justice of India, then Chief Justice of India, called it a parrot in cage, and the recent times suggested how not only the CBI and the other agencies have been misused. And I believe that this would ultimately end in some political slugfest, and the main issue of systemic change in the police would be completely would be kept aside and would not be properly addressed. Perhaps a constitution of a SIT would be a better option, in my opinion. In my opinion, also the confining the inquiry to the allegations made at hand is the court has missed an opportunity. They should have gone back to the Prakash Singh case and should have asked very pertinent questions. And I think I read some 7 questions posed by Mr. Ribeiro to Paramveer Singh and Mr. Vaze and many other police officers. In fact, according to me, this was a great opportunity for the judiciary to show some leadership in the matter. With the executive's direct involvement in the allegations, only the courts are left to intervene. But the courts need to treat this path carefully and intelligently. To begin with, the courts must recognize that reforms are needed all over the country, not just in Mumbai or Maharashtra. Reforms cannot be undertaken in piecemeal fashion. Means should be devised to ensure that the police leadership is properly appointed. For when you have leaders that are selected on the basis of merit and honesty, and not on the basis of their proximity to political parties, things will automatically change. In her interview, Virat Borwankar interestingly named few officers who she believed are officers with great integrity in Maharashtra police, but they may not get a chance to head the police. From from colonial times, the police have been considered to be the ruler's police. We have continued the same. Now it's the police of the governing class. This needs to transform into a people's police. And most importantly, any informed conversation must be consultative and participatory. It must be holistic and multi-layered, recognizing the many facets of policing and its role in the larger criminal justice system. It must have a long-term vision, recognizing the state-specific concern as well as acknowledging universal problems. You cannot have an identical police system all over the country. That's a bad idea. But therefore, I said that you must acknowledge the uniform problems, universal problems, and also recognize the special needs of the particular states. It must have human rights and accountability at its heart and encourage equal opportunity and non-discrimination. If these basic principles and rules are followed, I think there is some hope for a better police and a better future for India. So thank you. I again thank the Pcgt and also the Praveen Gandhi Law College for inviting me to address this gathering of young students. I heard about how the proceedings were conducted, how Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, and the state level discussions. And Mr. Ribeiro said that the discussions were perhaps of a better quality than what is happening in actual. And one of the things which I spoke on this, that the role of the parliament, and I'm very concerned with that. And parliament's role is getting diminished every day, and particularly in pandemic times, the parliament was, as I said, in somewhere else, that it became a ghost town. In many other countries, parliaments were either through video conferencing or through some partly physical, partly through video conferencing. Our parliaments have not really done well. So hopefully, as Mr. Ribeiro puts it, with all this young generation, we might really hope for change in the future. And it is as one of the speakers mentioned, and so correctly, that don't look at the politics as a dirty water, unless you are actually you participate in this actively. It's not going to change. These things will change with the young students. With we call these days what Mr. Raja said about the Nehruvian era, where everybody was enthusiastic about investing in that. So have these similar things in mind, and I wish you very best for your future and for your future career. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your words of wisdom. I would agree with you that this is actually the need of the hour, and that certain problems that were mentioned, that is the VIP culture in police or the police brutality in form of encounters or custodial deaths, is very much critical for our country's development in front of the whole world as well. At the same time, would expect the bureaucracy and the leadership to take up a productive and progressive outlook when they are in the parliament making laws for the same. And I would expect that all of us here can have an active